I've been interested in social media well before it was called social media. Um, and it's a problematical term because it suggests that there are non-social media or anti-social media. Media are technologies that allow people to communicate with one another, that carry messages from person to person. The idea that you could have a medium that was not social seems pretty nonsensical. So social media is in some sense redundant. Uh, we could call it other things. Web 2.0 has been thrown around, but like social media, it's generally used just to refer to a bunch of innovations on the web and elsewhere that are new, right? It's basically, at least it's a little bit more honest about it. By saying 2.0, it simply says this is stuff that's happened more recently, I think. And so there are lists of both business models or businesses or websites or facets of those websites, characteristics that seem more Web 2.0-ish or more social media-ish. But it's a very open kind of a definition. And when we're trying to think about computing and social media, it's useful to try to figure out what we mean by that. Judith Donath has this term sociable media, which I don't use very much, but I like it that it gets away from this fairly bland idea that media are social. By describing some media as being sociable, you suggest that they are somehow capable or have affordances, which is a term we use to talk about what technologies can do or have the capability of doing, that some technologies seem to provide for people to come together in a more convivial way and become more sociable. So it has this kind of action, right? It says, this isn't just technology that serves the already social functions that we need. We have a need to interact socially, and it kind of fills in and does that. It actually encourages more social interaction in some sense. And I like that as an idea. I don't use it, but I like it as an idea, if only because it gets away from this idea that, there is some subclass of media that are in some way social. Okay. Some of this goes back, and I think it's worth looking at J.C.R. Lickliter's idea of the computer as a communication device. And Lick, as he was known, had this paper where he talks about the computer as a communication device that now looks kind of quaint and obvious. And I think as scholars, we all really, really hope we can write something that someday is considered quaint and obvious, right? In retrospect, the true mark of genius is that in retrospect it looks really obvious. And today when we look at something like that, where the claim is that we could use, hey, we can use computers to communicate with one another, that seems really, really obvious. And at the time it seemed really, really counterintuitive. That you would use machines that were worth millions of dollars in the same way you use a telephone just seemed to be ridiculous. And so I want to kind of touch and tease that apart a little bit. If we didn't think computers were for communication, what did we think they were for? Well, the first answer is we thought they were for computing. Okay, so the word computer was not always used for the machine. It was for some time a job title. You might say, what do you do for a living? I'm a computer. That is someone who would sit down and calculate things. Things like, in some cases, things like accounts, but generally things like tide tables or something along those lines. So you would sit down and you would be really good at adding up numbers. That would be kind of your function. And we can see computers well before the digital computer, right? So here's the 3-minute history of computing, right? You might go back to something like the Antikythera mechanism, which people weren't quite sure what it was, other than it was a very old mechanism, but eventually most people have agreed that it has something to do with calculating astronomical movement, probably to help navigation in some way. But this is kind of a very old device, and you can track that through this kind of geared device through to something like the Pascaline, which is it's called a Pascaline, although Blaise Pascal was just one of many who were creating these small calculators. Pascal his father was a tax collector, and so he thought it would be helpful to his dad to not have to employ calculators or to actually do the pen and paper calculations himself, and so created this machine that would help him do some of this stuff. And then through the Charles Babbage's difference engine at the beginning of the 19th century, this idea of building a machine that initially would actually replace those people called calculators by creating tide tables. And then eventually his proposal for an analytic engine that could do much more than that, and is really the precursor of the modern computer, or at least the idea of computing. Turing took this idea that that you could design a computer that could compute any computable function. And so he kind of generalized this idea of a computer as a device that could compute things, that could come up with an answer. And Turing, again, well before his time, said, hey, if you look at this and then you look at the way the neurons work in the human being, we start to look like one of those machines that can compute any computable function. So he started to think about intelligence as being in some way related to computation. As part of that idea, he has this concept of the Turing machine, this kind of abstract idea of a computer. And as part of that idea, he also said that computers were good at, well, I shouldn't say were good at, required at its basic level the ability to do some kind of memory, right? If you're going to be able to compute something, you have to be able to temporarily store generally numbers, although eventually this became things other than numbers, became facts in some sense, or documents. Again, there's this whole record of and we've skipped over a bunch, right? From the Antikythera mechanism, you could also look, I mean, you could even go back further than that and go to the Egyptians or Stonehenge or wherever around the world and look at some of the architectural things that people have suggested are used for computing, often computing, again, astronomical events. So we've left off a whole bunch of stuff in there in terms of computation, but the same could be said of document control, right? You could go back to papyrus and then all the way through, and this kind of huge increase with the rise of bureaucracy as a way of organizing things. Again, mainly in the 19th century, but going into the 20th century as well. Way before you had computers to do this stuff, you had all kinds of innovations in office machinery and ways of filing things. There were books written in the 19th century about how best to stack things on your desk so you could find them later. And why did you have to have a book like this? Well, because you had to have a way of finding documents before you had things like file drawers. You know, we think of file drawers as, again, being very, very obvious, or hanging files especially. But hanging files are a huge advancement over vertical files. And vertical files were a huge advancement over horizontal files. Again, for many, many decades in an office, you'd go in and you'd find files stacked up horizontally in cabinets designed for that. You had this kind of innovation in desks and that sort of thing, of the use of pigeonholes, ways of sorting things using pigeonholes. And this, again, was a technology that had to be invented, or ways of using carbon paper to keep local copies of correspondence that you'd send out. All of these were things that had to be invented well before the computer came into the use as a document control system. And I guess we could pass it through and say, you had this idea of punch cards for a long time. The Jacquard loom actually used the punch card as a way of routinizing the process of creating woven stuff, socks and blankets and whatever else. You no longer had to keep in the weaver's memory what they should be doing. It could be stored on this punch card, right? And this idea of punch cards then kind of moved its way into business machinery, and you could punch cards, and Herman Hollerith, the head of what would eventually become IBM, started to use this. Punch cards were being used in lots of places, but it turned out at the end of the 19th century that the U.S. Census was taking more than 10 years to actually add up the responses, and so he had this innovation of using punch cards to do that and add them up much more quickly. And so punch cards became this kind of way of holding information. Eventually CRTs, cathode ray tubes, what we usually, people my age think of as the way you look on a computer screen, those were CRTs for many years, were originally designed as a way of just kind of holding information as the computer was computing. Tapes and magnetic tapes, all these kinds of innovation over time that led, and again, this is much later than the idea of computers for computing, that led to computers as business machines, as ways of storing huge amounts of data. And it turns out that was really what, you came out of World War II with these computers that were designed mainly for doing one of two things. computing the trajectory of artillery, so you knew where it would land, or code breaking, right? So figuring out, deciphering messages. I mean, those were the main uses of computers during the Second World War. But coming out of the war, you had to commercialize this stuff, and it turned out that insurance companies really needed it to keep track of these huge collections of data of all of their clients, and so it became this recording system. And certainly by the end of the 20th century, I remember when I was fairly young, this idea that digital music was fine, but it would never overtake analog recordings because you just couldn't get the same kind of fidelity in a digital recording. And you still, I think even today you find some people who say, oh, you have to shoot on film because, we can't get the same kind of quality in digital. And that's just nonsense, right? I mean, at this point, that seems very dated as an idea, because the idea of storing stuff as digital information has now become the norm, right? The standard. So now we have those two things. We have computation as one way of thinking about what computers do, and we have data storage or file storage as an important piece as well. So where does the idea of the computer as a communication device come in? And again, I'm going to go pre-digital computers, and I'm going to pick out, well, I mean, we could pick out a lot of things, right? We could talk about visual telegraphy or optical telegraphy. So you know what the telegraph is, Morse code, and Morse comes to the U.S. government and says, I can build you this electronic telegraph. Well, why did he call it an electric telegraph to start with, and then electronic communications after that? So why did he specify that it was an electric telegraph? Why not just call it the telegraph? Well, because telegraphs were actually in wide use by the time Morse came around. It's just that they didn't use electrical wires. The French government, for example, had a fairly widespread optical telegraph developed by a guy named Claude Chappie, and this telegraph system had a bunch of towers, and it would use semaphores, right? It would manipulate arms in the sky, and arms attached to it in various symbols, and then someone at the next tower would be looking through a telescope and see what was written, and then kind of turn around and write that, or not write that, but show that to the next tower, and you could send a message across France in a matter of less than an hour, and so it was a very powerful way of communicating. And you could actually go before that and talk about things like smoke signals and hydraulic telegraphs, and it had been used in various ways before we got to the electronic piece of it. But that is less interesting to me than a person you probably have not heard of, a guy named Almond Stroger. And Stroger, well, you probably have heard of either Alexander Graham Bell or Elijah Gray, depending on who you believe invented the telephone, and there are about 2 or 3 other people that have made claim to it. Bell, of course, developed the telephone as a hearing aid to start with. His mother was a pianist who'd gone deaf, and so his interest was creating a way for the deaf to be able to hear better. So that was his initial interest in creating the telephone. But then he had this device and had to figure out a way to make money off of it, and so this process of how the telephone came to be what we think of it today. In early cases, it wasn't a switched network. In other words, the party line was the standard thing. In fact, in Budapest, there was this project called Telefon Mundo, which was this way of creating, it was kind of a radio broadcast before the radio came in. Same time every day, 6 o'clock, everyone would pick up their telephone and get a broadcast of the day's news, the herald of the day's news. And so the idea of the telephone as we think of it today, where you pick up the phone and you get to talk to someone point to point, was not set in stone to start with. I'm going to come back to that idea in a minute. You know how the telephone works probably from old movies, that before we had automatically switched telephones, you'd pick it up and you'd tell the operator who you wanted to talk to, and the operator would sit there and plug the plug in and probably listen in while they were going along. In fact, Stroger was he had an interesting kind of life, and we don't know a lot about it, but we do know that he ended up in Kansas City after the Civil War as a mortician, first as a school teacher, then as a mortician. One of at least two morticians in town. Problem was, when people died, someone would pick up the phone and talk to the operator, and the operator would say, connect me to a mortician, we need someone out here. And the telephone operator was a competing mortician's wife. So necessity being the mother of invention, the wife of invention, something like that. Stroger decided that he needed to figure out a way to get rid of his competition's wife, or at least her meddling in who got to get the call when someone died, and came up with this way of doing automatic switches. And Stroger switches ended up being the standard switches for almost 100 years. You can still see telephone boxes with Stroger on them, although most of them are going away at this point because we don't have mechanical switches in that same way anymore. But they were automatic switches. Now, there's an interesting history there of why it took so long for those automatic switches to become the standard. It did take quite a while before people accepted them rather than having humans sit there and switch you. But I think I think he is underappreciated as being a really important person, or at least a really important device in the process of what became the internet. I mean, if you think about the path from the automatically switched telephone call, where you pick up the phone, you dial a number, and a machine figures out how to connect that to another person. That ability of a machine to automatically switch things, I think, is a really essential piece of what the internet is and what the internet becomes, because you have to have the ability for machines to be able to make those connections and figure out how a message should be routed from one place to another. Of course, we can talk about people, especially during the end of the 1960s, who come up with the essential ideas of a packet switch network and a bunch of other pieces there. But I think very essential to this is the idea of a switched network at all. And so the idea that Stroger came up with, that you could devise a switch that automatically let your telephone call go through, now internationally, now meaning in the last 3 decades or so, you can direct dial internationally. But the idea that you really didn't need a human interceding in making a phone call, I think, is really important to what the internet becomes, and really important to what we call social media today. Why? Today we think about this kind of, the internet really surrounds us as an ether. The amount of information literally kind of passing through by my head right now, that is digital information being switched digitally, is just enormous. It's almost inconceivable. The idea that you could pick up a device and from this be able to be connected to a worldwide network, not as hyperbole, but really a worldwide network of digital information, is just amazing. That's where we are today. But what's important is a characteristic of that, especially for the social media piece. When we talk about social media, I think one of the characteristics that we're talking a lot about is that it's symmetric. In other words, it's different from broadcast. Now, the telephone system, the traditional plain old telephone system, was also symmetric, right? Anyone could call anyone. I could pick up the phone, conceivably at least, and call the President of the United States. It wasn't like there was one person in charge of the telephone network, as opposed to, say, broadcast television. The term broadcast comes from what farmers do. They hold a bunch of seeds and they throw them out. And so it is really a one-way kind of communication, or if not one way, at least it's highly asymmetric. That is, one person has a great deal of communicative power, a great deal of being able to get their message out, and other people don't have that same level of power. So I think when we talk about social media, we often are talking about media that are much more symmetric, that everybody has at least some opportunity to get in and have a share at doing something with that network. And the telephone system, again, is an ideal example of a symmetric kind of network, but we don't usually, I don't know why not, but we don't usually think of the plain voice telephone as being a social medium, in the same way that we talk about kind of modern networked, Facebook, whatever, yada, yada, yada. So one of the characteristics is that it's symmetric. The other is that it is, so just to back up for a second, I just gave an example. Let's take an example of radio broadcasting. Radio broadcasting started out symmetric, okay? So like a lot of technologies, it started out with anyone being able to pick up a ham radio. And, if I want to start a radio station, I throw an antenna on my roof and I can do it. So it started out being fairly symmetric. Anyone could kind of get into it. Anyone, it's a lot of the rhetoric surrounding it is similar to, Robert McChesney had a great article about this early on in the web saying, hey, we've heard all of this before. It was radio circa 1920, when anybody could start their own radio station. And then eventually, over time, through both regulation and in some ways through the technology, or hand-in-hand regulation and technology, and the economy and sort of big commercial interests being able to win out, you ended up with a broadcast radio system that was increasingly concentrated, so that fewer and fewer people were developing the message that more and more people heard. So I'll just note that these things are not fixed. The telephone is another example. The way we think of the telephone today was certainly not the way that anyone had kind of assumed that it would end up. It just kind of evolved in that direction. One of the characteristics of social media is that symmetry, but the other characteristic is the ability to very quickly and flexibly change the level of symmetry. So it's not the same as the phone system where everyone gets an equal vote. In fact, the web as a whole tends to concentrate, but there are little clumps of concentration that make social media interesting. So it's the ability to be symmetric, but also the ability to not have symmetry forced on you, I guess you could say, or to say that the topography, for want of a better word, the way things are connected can be easily molded. I think of it as kind of like silly putty, right? The structure of it can be switched when people find an opportunity for switching it. So as we go through the semester and we talk about social media, in these very broad terms, I do want to keep coming back to this idea of how much symmetry is involved in a particular system or a particular arrangement or the way people are using a particular technology, and how much flexibility, how much moldability does the technology itself have? Do you have something where it's concentrating over time, where more and more people have, or fewer and fewer people have more and more influence? Or is it something that is more variable, and for a while someone might have more influence, but someone comes and usurps it quickly? And what does it mean when you have that kind of, when people can actually be elevated in terms of their ability to speak to more people, and if that's a very temporary situation, as opposed to something that becomes more and more permanent. All right, so the two things, symmetry and flexibility, I think are the key hallmarks of social media, and we'll kind of try to look for those as we go through the rest of the semester.